When you start a garden, you often need some kind of input, whether that's soil, fertilizer, raised beds, trellises, but there's one soil amendment that has caused quite a bit of controversy, and that would be peat moss. So peat moss is in most of the bag mixes that you buy, no matter where you get them from, and a lot of it comes from Canada, from these peat bogs, and there's some environmental concerns about using it, so a lot of gardeners are saying, hey, don't use peat moss, use coconut coir instead. But which one is better, both from a gardener's perspective and maybe a sustainability and environmental perspective? To find out, we have our new gardener here on the Epic Gardening platform. Many of you saw her in our recent video about seeds we're excited to grow in 2022. Chris up in Vancouver, BC. She lives near some peat bogs, so we sent her up there to give you guys a breakdown in this Digging Deeper series on peat moss versus coconut coir.
Hey, it's Chris, and you are probably wondering where the heck I am, because this is not a garden. It's obviously not my garden, and you're probably also wondering how I'm going to talk about today's topic, which is peat versus coir if I'm not in the greenhouse with bags of media to compare. Well, it's a nice day in Vancouver, so I thought I'd take you out for a walk, and I can also give you some backgrounder and some context around this topic before we go into details. So right now I am on top of the remnants of what used to be a much larger raised bog ecosystem just outside of Vancouver. So this is Lulu Island Bog in the city of Richmond, and what's really cool about this place is that it's a nature park now, so people can come in and visit and really get a sense of what a bog environment is all about. And I really want to try to look for a patch of this key player in a bog environment, which is sphagnum moss. Now, if you're a gardener or if you've picked up a bag of potting mix and you've probably read the ingredient sphagnum moss from Canada or peat moss, this is the stuff we're going to look for. And here we have sphagnum moss. I was able to find some. It doesn't look like much, but it's here. So in a lot of bog environments, the top layer is this beautiful living green layer of moss, and then underneath that layer is where you're going to find the peat. And if you're wondering what peat is, it is actually the dead and decomposing stuff that you see at the top here. So the sphagnum moss that has over time broken down over thousands and thousands of years and then worked its way down into the ground. Unfortunately, human activities like peat mining can damage these layers, and it could be years, like we're talking decades, before even the top living green sphagnum moss layer can regrow and recover to a point where it can then cycle back into the ground as peat. Peat harvesting practices are highly disruptive, and they actually require the drainage of the bog. So literally a ditch is dug to drain a bog so that equipment can come onto the site and start to harvest the top sphagnum moss layers as well as the deeper peat layers. After harvest, and without this lower peat layer, the boggy conditions where the water table was quite high and the top surface was quite saturated, all of that is lost. And with the new drier conditions, sphagnum moss and other bog species have a much harder time surviving. And also the remaining peat that is exposed then decomposes at a much faster rate. Not only are these carbon stores destroyed and removed, the now drier environment becomes more hospitable to different plants like trees and shrubs. And although it doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with that, over time they displace the original bog species. And unfortunately, this is what we're seeing here at this site. There are a number of trees, and this bog is not so much a pure bog anymore. It's classified more as a bog forest. This is Burns Bog. It's another raised bog just outside of Vancouver, and it's roughly 5,000 years old. It used to be double the size of what it currently is right before agriculture, peat extraction, and industrial activities greatly reduced the size. Burns Bog is now a conservation area because more and more people are understanding the importance of bog ecosystems. And if you're wondering why I'm talking so much about bogs, well, it's because globally, bogs and all of the peat and all of the moss, they are huge carbon sinks. So they hold on to a lot of carbon, they sequester carbon, and it prevents the release of all this carbon up into the atmosphere where it can be very harmful and contribute to greenhouse gases. So it's like I magically teleported myself back into the greenhouse. It was raining at the bog, so I had to get out of there fast. But I think you have a sense of what sphagnum moss looks like up close and also in the wild. Now, I did mention that sphagnum moss breaks down into peat. And this is what peat looks like when it's all prepared for us to use as gardeners. It's brown, it's fluffy, and you will usually find it as a bagged product. Now, gardeners and professional growers rely heavily on peat, like really heavily. Whether you are starting plants from seeds or via cuttings or maybe container growing, it could be like small scale at home or a balcony, or maybe if you're planting out a large commercial project, a lot of people turn to peat. Now, what I'm trying to get at here is that it doesn't really matter what kind of gardener you are, you're probably reaching for peat because it's familiar, kind of affordable, and quite readily available. But why is that? Now, if you're gardening in North America, the reason why peat seems so readily available is because Canada is home to about a third of the world's peatlands or bogs. And about 15% of this country is covered with this boggy landscape. And that's probably why Canada is the top producer and exporter of horticultural grade peat moss. Now, peatlands and this type of wetland is not specific to Canada. You can find bogs in northern parts of Asia and also northern Europe. And although it may seem like these kind of areas are in great abundance, it really doesn't mean that whatever is extracted from these areas is sustainable or anywhere close to being a renewable resource. Let's take a look at what happened in the UK. So historically, the coastal blanket bogs, which are slightly different from the raised bogs that we visited, they were heavily mined for their peat. So over time, the peat stores were depleted. The species in bogs, both flora and fauna, greatly reduced, and also just the general size of these habitats were greatly reduced. And with that, the peat stores that were holding on to carbon, they were no longer there to help keep the climate stable. But what's really great now is seeing this movement in the UK, especially with prominent gardeners, is this banding together and sharing of this message that, hey, maybe there are better alternatives to peat. Like let's not use this material in our gardens as a soil amender anymore. And then also on the conservation end, it's really great to see a lot of efforts put towards rebuilding these ecosystems so that they can be more self-sustaining in the future. In Canada, more bogs and wetlands are now being recognized as highly important ecosystems that must be protected. Now, Burns Bog, where we were just at, is a great example of how individuals, groups, and 4 levels of government, so the federal, provincial, regional, and municipal, coming together to protect and preserve and really bring the health of these bog ecosystems back up to a level where it's going to be in a good state for the future. And with all this reading into what's going on the conservation side, it makes me wonder what the players on the peat moss harvesting side, like what they're doing to kind of improve the situation of peat bogs. So from what I was able to look up, it does seem like the players in the peat moss industry are involved and they are committed to more environmentally sound practices, especially when it comes to restoring peatlands post-harvest. And there's also some forms of research around trying to accelerate the regeneration of moss in those areas. But it still makes me wonder how big of a positive impact it has on like the big scheme of things after the fact, like after the peat has been pulled from the land. Because let's just go back to what I said earlier with the formation of peat. It takes a long time for that sphagnum moss layer to actually decompose in conditions where it's cool and wet and not really conducive to breaking down. So some food for thought. And really, I think in short, it's hard to classify peat as a sustainable material for us to use in the garden, just based on the sheer volume that both industry and home gardeners use this material, and just taking into consideration how slowly it takes this material to form. Now, you may be wondering why so many people still reach for peat for their gardening activities, even though there's more and more information coming out telling us about the negative impacts it has on the environment through harvesting and also just the general use of peat. Well, the truth is, as gardeners and professionals, we are just accustomed to growing plants in a peat-based mix, and we like how plants respond to peat. And some of the properties that we like is its ability to hold moisture. sometimes depending on what you're growing, a little bit too much moisture, but it also has the ability to provide good aeration. So some good pore space down there to keep the roots healthy. And also, if you look here, ignore the white perlite bits. It is a rather homogeneous mix. It is quite easy to use. It can also hold on to nutrients quite well. And compared to one of its alternatives, it is not a salty product, and more on that in just a sec. If you start researching peat alternatives, you're likely going to come across coconut coir or simply coir, which is a coconut processing byproduct. So whether that's coconut milk, water, oil, or the flesh. And let's just quickly talk about what this brown stuff is, because there is that misconception that this brown stuff, because of the coloration, comes from the inner part of the coconut that, like when we see in the supermarkets, is that brown, dry stuff. But this actually comes from the mesocarp layer. And if we picture a young coconut, it would be that fibrous layer between the green outer part and also that smaller round inner part. So this is what this stuff is all about. And this product usually comes compressed in blocks. It's easy to store, and to rehydrate it, you just add some hot water or some warm water and it expands. I don't have a block available to show you, but I do have a bag of ready-made stuff. So it's quite handy to use. It does feel and look a lot like peat, but I do have to say it's not an exact substitution. So there are some things to consider before you just switch completely over to coir. First, let's talk about some great qualities of coir by comparing it to peat when it comes to watering. Now, if you've ever tried to water a dry peat mix or a container that has like a peat crust on top, you know that it's really difficult to water. And that's because peat is naturally hydrophobic. It repels water. It does not want to absorb that water unless that product already has some surfactant or some wetting agent baked into the product. But coir, on the other hand, is quite different. It is very easy to water. So I know that it has great infiltration. So infiltration meaning that the water can enter the surface of the medium. And because it has a whole bunch of airspace, it's a nice fluffy material, it has great percolation too. So that means the water travels through the mix and out through the bottom. So I know that this coir has great drainage due to that aeration porosity. Now, this is a great situation if you're growing plants that are a little bit more sensitive to having wet feet, or maybe you have a tendency to overwater your plants. If those cases are true, then this could be a great medium for you to look into. And another great thing with coir is that it breaks down slower than peat. So it'll last longer. Although there are some really great properties of coir, we need to talk about the things that you need to consider before you start using coir in the garden. The first one is, well, you need to know that coir is inert, meaning it's a material that lacks nutrients. So you need to know what you're going to grow, what those plants' requirements are nutrition-wise, and how you're going to supply those nutrients to the plants. Another thing you need to think about is whether it's a good fit for the type of plant you want to grow. Like I mentioned before, it's a good medium to grow plants that don't like a wet root zone because of that really good drainage. So if you have plants that like the drier conditions, it could be a good fit. But if your plants are looking for extra moisture over a long period of time, it may not be the best material. And related, I would not start seeds in straight up coir just because I know that this media dries a lot faster. And for proper seed germination, you need that consistent moisture. And also when you're shopping for coir, the quality and grade is all over the place. So one bag may look great like mine, but another one may have quite inconsistent texture with some stringy bits, some chunky bits, and some really, really fine bits. So sometimes it's like a hit and miss. Sometimes you get a really good bag. So that's something that you need to be aware of. Earlier, when I was talking about a peat alternative that is quite salty, I was referring to coir, not because the plants are grown along sometimes the coast where they draw up a lot of salts from the soil. I'm mostly referring to the salts and the chemicals that are absorbed into the fibers during the harvesting and processing of coir. So as a part of the coir processing, some chemicals need to be applied to fully extract the fibrous parts from the coconut. And now we're really thinking about the environmental impacts of using coir. So it's not a perfect product, and let me tell you why. So during the processing, the salts that have accumulated in the fibers and also the chemicals applied, they need to be flushed out before we can use them for our gardening tasks. And in a lot of these areas where fresh water is scarce, it's probably not the best practice that we want to see happening. So a lot of this fresh water is used to flush all of these materials out of the coir. It goes into the waters. So there's that piece to think about. And also a lot of these hot areas include India and Sri Lanka. And when that product is processed and ready to come to us, if you are watching in North America, if we think about the map, that's quite a ways away from where we garden. So peat versus coir. Is there one that is better? Well, it's really hard to say just based on what we went over. But I know for me personally, and with my gardening practices at home, I'm going to try my best to look for peat alternatives that are better for the environment. And thankfully for me, I live in an area that has a lot of conifers, so composted conifer bark is an option, especially if I am working with some established perennials. So I'm definitely going to explore that. But yeah, there's a lot to learn. And if you are curious as well, I encourage you to just keep exploring and trying them. I'm not trying to say that any of these materials is super bad. I mean, they're in the industry. We've used them for quite some time, and for good reason. They have some really great properties. But now that we learn about the environmental impacts, it's up to us as gardeners who care about plants, care about the environment, to take that extra step, do the research, and try to make the best choices that we can.
Here at Epic Gardening, we try to look as holistically as we can about the entirety of whether something is true or false in the garden. You know, straight up, there's just a lot of gardening misinformation out there based on legendary tales and stories passed down through generations that simply just doesn't hold up to the scrutiny when you actually look at it. But peat moss use is something that we are trying to ramp down here and looking for alternatives like coconut coir and others. So hopefully this video was a good breakdown for you to make a more educated choice on whether you should or shouldn't use peat moss, whether you're making your own soil mix or buying it in bags. And until next time, good luck in the garden and keep on growing.